anything I read, any information I find, any event that occurs, any legislation that gets passed, I put up here. Okay, anything that I find to be significant.
Welcome to episode 26 of the Horror Double Bill, the podcast where each week we pair two movies to create something far greater than the sum of their parts. I'm Craig Johnson, and this week we are entering the world of conspiracies and paranoia, with two films that feature journalist protagonists falling into increasingly dangerous territory. First up, we return to the Italian giallo with Short Night of Glass Dolls from 1971, directed by Aldo Lado and starring Jean Sorel, Ingrid Thulin, Barbara Bach and Mario Adorf. Then we jump forward to 2012 and our second faux documentary of the series with The Conspiracy from director Christopher MacBride, starring Poole and James Gilbert. Along the way, we'll be discussing the careers of Aldo Lado and Jean Sorel, the not-so-secret societies, the Bilderberg Group and the Bohemian Grove, the cognitive biases that come into play with conspiracy theories, and much, much more. But before we do any of that, as always, I'd like to begin by listing the main references that I've used in researching this week's episode, all of which will be listed or linked in the show notes. When discussing Short Night of Glass Dolls, I have heavily referenced an interview with Aldo Lado from the book Darkening the Italian Screen Part 2, edited by Eugenio Ercolani. I've also referred to an interview with Aldo Lado called When Butterflies Turn to Glass and a documentary called Checkmate, both of which can be found on the 88 Films Blu-ray restoration of the movie. And I've also reviewed commentaries and interviews with Aldo Lado and Jean Sorel that can be found on the Celluloid Dreams 4K restoration of the film. And when discussing The Conspiracy, I have referred to numerous interviews given by Christopher MacBride and Poole, and these can be found on the websites Fangoria, thatshelf.com, femalefirst.co.uk, bloodydisgusting.com, and Starburst magazine. And so, without any further ado, we are getting into our first film of the week, which is Short Night of Glass Dolls from 1971, directed by Aldo Lado and starring Jean Sorel, Ingrid Thulin, Barbara Bach and Mario Adorf. Aldo Lado was born in 1934 in the city of Fiume, now known as Rijeka in Croatia, but at that time it was part of Italy, having been annexed in 1924. Following the end of the Second World War, in May 1945, Yugoslav forces took control of the city, and the Lado family home and property were confiscated, forcing them to flee to Venice. Something that the director later described as happening, quote, virtually in our underwear, end quote. Settling in Venice, it was here that the young Lado first encountered cinema through screenings projected by American sailors onto screens displayed on the ships stationed in the San Marco Basin. From St. Mark's Square, he would watch these films, projected onto large screens on the cruisers, which included a mix of propaganda reels and Hollywood musicals, starring Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. He recalled that he never missed a single one, and it was through this experience that he fell in love with cinema. As he grew older, he would save as much as he could to spend on tickets to the local theatres, and he even recalled selling his school books on more than one occasion to buy himself a ticket. After each movie, he would talk with the other cinema goers, and it was here, he said, that he began to appreciate the emotional impact of cinema, and that audiences were essentially looking for an emotional release. And this was a lesson he carried through into his own work once he began to direct. His father wanted him to become a state councillor, a job that would provide stability and a regular income. But his early love for cinema never truly disappeared. At the age of 20, he met a man called Roman Scarpa, who was 7 years his senior and who had his own animation studio in Venice. Pretty soon, the two started working together, beginning with small animation projects and then graduating to commercials and shorts. But even though this was closer to the world of film than working as a state councillor, it still wasn't close enough. Having fallen in love with Paris on an earlier trip, he decided to move there with the aim of introducing himself into the French film world. Buying a magazine which contained a list of films that were in production, he began a process of door-knocking, visiting every film set, hoping that somebody would take him on. He's recalled this period as being challenging, to say the least, sleeping in a bunkhouse and eating in soup kitchens. But after 2 months, he was lucky enough to knock on the door of an Italian-French co-production. This was a film called 5 Minutes to Midnight, which stars Sophia Loren and Anthony Perkins, and was directed by Anatole Litvak. As we discussed back in episode 2, legislation at the time meant that, for a production to be considered Italian, even in part, a certain percentage of the cast and crew had to be Italian nationals, and this was also the case here. Lado was hired primarily to fulfill the quota of Italian crew members, and was given the title of assistant director, though in reality he was paid a very small salary simply so that his name could appear in the credits. Interestingly enough, though, this was something that he himself would have to do years later on Short Night of Glass Dolls, hiring German crew to ensure that it could legitimately be classed as a German co-production. He's later gone on to say that many of the names that appeared in the end credits played little to no part in the making of the movie. Although his employment was for political and economic rather than creative purposes, and he's also recalled that most of the time he was ignored or treated as though he was invisible, he was determined to make the most of the opportunity. He had noticed that Anatole Litvak was a habitual pipe smoker who continually forgot where he left his pipe, and one day seized an opportune moment and slipped it into his pocket. When he later returned it, it gave him the perfect excuse to make himself known to the director, and, what do you know, the trick worked. Litvak not only learned who he was, but also began to trust him with various jobs, something that escalated when his first assistant director caught pneumonia. At this point, Litvak began giving him real work to do, entrusting him with preparing the set, checking the positioning of the camera, and also the lighting and makeup. So, there you go. Sometimes honesty really isn't the best policy. Once the film was completed, Litvak asked Lado to assist with editing and essentially gave the would-be director what he called a crash course in film production. These were lessons that he would carry forward with him into his next role, which was working as an assistant director for the French filmmaker Marcel Carnet. From there, he moved between various productions, sometimes as an AD, sometimes writing subtitles, and sometimes working in post-production. Returning to Italy, he began working on the numerous spaghetti westerns that had become incredibly popular, most notably collaborating with director Maurizio Lucidi. As well as feeding his appetite for cinema, this work also allowed him to indulge a second passion, which was travel, a love that he had developed through reading the works of Ernest Hemingway. As well as Paris, he travelled to Israel and Spain, and in late 1969 travelled to Prague to scout locations for a movie. At the time, Prague was part of the Czechoslovak Socialist Republic, but in 1968 it had become the setting for a 7-month period of political mass protest that became known as the Prague Spring. On the 5th of January 1968, Alexander Dubček was elected First Secretary and attempted to introduce reforms that would grant greater rights to the people, loosening restrictions on the media, freedom of speech, and travel. Needless to say, these reforms were not particularly well received by the USSR, who, along with their allies, sent in troops and tanks to occupy the country. The New York Times estimated that the total force was around 650,000 men, equipped with, quote, the most modern and sophisticated weapons in the Soviet military catalogue, which also included 4,600 tanks. Although the Soviets predicted that the occupation would take just 4 days, resistance continued for almost 8 months, and became an incredibly high-profile example of civilian-based defense. The movement was eventually crushed in August 1968, when Soviet forces fully reasserted control and Dubček was removed from power. In the years that followed, a period known as normalization began, which was marked by political repression, censorship, and the reinstatement of hardline communist rule. The film for which he was scouting never came to fruition, but the city of Prague would stay in his mind, striking him with its atmosphere that he called, quote, a fear of living that you could just sense in the air, end quote. No wonder then that, just a few years later, it would become the setting for his debut movie, Short Night of Glass Dolls, a film that has more than a few political themes running through its narrative. It was also during this period, when working on a film directed by Maurizio Lucidi, that Lado met another would-be director, and I'm going to quote directly here from Lado himself in an interview he gave for the book Darkening the Italian Screen Part 2, which is edited by Eugenio Ercolani. Quote, at the end of the 1960s, I worked as an assistant director on a film scripted by Dario Argento, who confided in me that he wanted to make a film from the novel The Screaming Mimi by Frederick Brown, of which he was unable to acquire the rights. I read the book and identified its most interesting starting point. Someone witnesses a murder, though he is unable to see the killer, who he believes, however, saw him. From here, we wrote an original story, which we decided to call The Bird with Crystal Feathers. I was then away filming in Israel and Spain, and never knew anything about the project until, on my return home, I discovered that Argento is shooting our film in Rome, but without my name anywhere on the project. The film is a huge success, reaping prizes and grossing 1,400 million lira, launching Dario Argento as the new world master of thrillers. I haven't spoken to him for 40 years. End quote. By 1970, Lado had worked as an assistant director on several westerns and was building a reputation as one of the best ADs in the industry, and this led him to working with Bernardo Bertolucci on the film The Conformist in 1970. Lado has recalled that he and Bertolucci had an incredibly productive relationship and that he contributed significantly to the final film, saying, quote, it was an extraordinary film in many respects. First of all, because there was an excellent understanding between me and Bernardo, and we always exchanged points of view. For example, he was crazy for long tracking shots and wanted to shoot the whole film this way, but I insisted, let's have 2 cuts, at least we'll have something to edit. After this, every now and then, Bernardo would say, we'll shoot this scene for Aldo, so he'll stop harassing me. End quote. In addition to his work as an assistant director, he had by now begun writing scripts, although often as an uncredited ghostwriter. For him, this was a financial necessity. By this point, he had a family to support, and while the AD work paid well enough, he believed he could earn a little extra by quote-unquote selling a few scripts here and there. He said that he essentially followed the trends of the time, starting off writing westerns, and then, as the giallo grew in popularity, moving into writing those. In 1971, his name appeared as a writer on the giallo The Designated Victim, which was directed by Maurizio Lucidi. This movie is pretty much a reworking of Alfred Hitchcock's Strangers on a Train, which was itself an adaptation of a novel by Patricia Highsmith. Lado, though, has said that the screenplay was less about following a trend and much more personal, set in his childhood home of Venice, and filled with more than a few touches of nostalgia for his past. To be completely honest, it's probably not my favourite giallo, and it certainly feels a little more dated than some of the others, but it's an enjoyable watch nevertheless. At around this time, he also started working with fellow director Pupi Avati, possibly best known to listeners as the creator of The House with Laughing Windows. The two had begun work on a screenplay adaptation of the 120 Days of Sodom by the Marquis de Sade. This was initially commissioned by the production company Euro and was originally planned to be a project for director Vittorio Sisti. However, this version of the story was never made. Lado has gone on to say that this was probably, quote, because it was too strong from a political standpoint and, more importantly, a sexual one, end quote. Regardless of the reason, Avati ended up working on a new draft of the screenplay with Pier Paolo Pasolini, but when Euro Studios went bankrupt, it looked like the film was never going to be made at all. A few years later, Avati was contacted by a lawyer and asked for a fee to give up the accreditation and rights to the screenplay. Eventually, a different version of the story, the controversial and highly political Salo, the 120 Days of Sodom, was released by Pasolini in 1974. Once seen, never forgotten, rather unfortunately in my case, it arrived with absolutely no sign of Lado's name attached, which may not necessarily be a bad thing. It is, however, a very interesting side note to the director's career, particularly when one considers the Sadian nature of some of the characters in his own movies. These would include the haute couture sadist from Late Night Trains in 1974, or Professor Carting from Short Night of Glass Dolls, who quite gleefully demonstrates that a tomato can feel pain by jamming a probe deep into its flesh and then crushing it between his fingers. Despite his by now extensive experience, Lado had no real aspirations to direct. As long as the money was coming in and he could work in the industry that he loved, he didn't really care as to the capacity in which he was employed, saying in later interviews, quote, "When you love a job as much as I love working in cinema, you don't care about being a director. A screenwriter, an assistant director, a grip or an electrician, whatever you do is good. If you love this job, you do anything with a pleasure. The important thing is just being in the world of cinema, and I think I proved this with the career that I had." End quote. Nevertheless, by this stage, he had already begun working on the screenplay that would become his directorial debut, a film that we now know as Short Night of Glass Dolls, but which began life in a very different form and with a very different title than the version we see today. And here we are getting into the spoilers, so if you have yet to see Short Night of Glass Dolls, as always, please approach with caution because I'm going to give the whole plot away. Short Night of Glass Dolls opens with an echo of Billy Wilder's 1950 film noir Sunset Boulevard. In Wilder's movie, we begin with the body of a writer floating in a swimming pool, a corpse who proceeds to tell us through voiceover and flashback the story of how he ended up face down in the water. Lado's movie begins in a similar way, with the discovery of an apparent dead man, a journalist who, through voiceover and flashback, takes us back through the events that led to his current state. The key difference, though, is that here, the journalist, Gregory Moore, is not dead at all. Fully conscious but completely paralysed, he seems to be suffering from some form of locked-in syndrome, which immediately preys on the primal fears of catalepsy or being buried alive, or, indeed in this case, being autopsied alive. Rushed to the hospital in an ambulance whose journey and blaring siren underpin the opening credits, Gregory is declared dead. The rest of the film alternates between flashbacks to uncover the mystery of the past and a tense series of scenes from the present, leaving the audience to wonder whether the true nature of his condition will be discovered in time. In this sense, Glass Dolls feels less of a giallo and more of a noir, borrowing not only from Billy Wilder, but also from the 1949 movie DOA, in which Edmund O'Brien has only a limited time to discover who administered him with a fatal dose of poison. However, there is much more going on beneath the surface of the movie than simple suspense. This film, like several of the director's other works, is distinctly political, something that he has said differentiates him from many of his contemporaries, saying in an interview with Eugenio Arcolani that, quote, "Most of what was being done were pure escapades, simple entertainment. I'm not saying that my films weren't, but what I was doing had a political content that other films just didn't have and didn't care to have." End quote. He did go on to say, however, that this political subtext often had to be very carefully concealed from producers whose eyes were fixed on commercial success and the demands of the market, explaining that if you wanted to tackle themes and elements, you had to hide them beneath what he called a sheepskin. My films, he said, always have a wolf hiding somewhere. The inspiration for the movie came from real life, particularly from the attempts of nonconformist judges to challenge the political corruption that was so prevalent in Italy at the time. These judges would inevitably fail in their efforts and would be reassigned to remote areas of the country where they could do quote-unquote less damage, something that the director has compared to being buried alive. Angered by this, he created a secret society called Club 99, which reflected the corrupt nature of the ruling classes, representing, as he put it, quote, the European bourgeoisie that is afraid of time and of the new generations, end quote. And even though he has said that he had to hide his political intentions, the political message is pretty plainly spelled out at the film's climax through a series of not too subtle, but nevertheless effective exchanges. Quote, the oldest person beats the drum and the youngest go to battle. We will hold the reins of power in the world, as long as there are people willing to be killed, willing to shed their own blood, and nothing must ever be changed. Our bitterest enemies are persons who love freedom. That is why we always have them removed. We destroy them. We must enslave the free to preserve our powers. We need the young to keep us alive. End quote. In addition, Club 99 are not just predatory, but are fervently nationalist. One of their employees attempts to chase Gregory from the premises, denouncing him as a foreigner, and later referring to him as a Westerner, something that he amusingly reveals he was able to identify by Gregory's choice of footwear. In cinematic terms, they are also an organisation which looks backwards to the Satanists of Rosemary's Baby and forward to the shape-shifting elite of Brian Yuzna's 1989 movie Society, the monstrous establishment that has always existed in the shadows, preying on the young to ensure their own survival. Deliberately portrayed as pale, monstrous and decrepit, the female members, with their garish makeup and dead-white complexions, look more like the living dead than the cultural elite, and if it was to turn out that Club 99 were actually vampires instead of Satanists, it really wouldn't be a surprise. The way in which they circle Mira when she arrives with Gregory near the beginning is remarkably predatory and brings to mind the barbecue scene in Get Out. The sense of grooming isn't helped by the snatched lines of dialogue as they surround her, whispering to each other about her sweet and trusting nature and commenting on the beauty of the young. When Gregory intervenes, joking that he must save her from the quote-unquote body snatchers, he has no idea how literal he is being. With its theme of a corrupt older generation preying on the youth and vitality of its children, Glass Dolls belongs not only to the realms of giallo and film noir, but also to a small group of movies from the same period that exploit similar fears and anxieties. These include Michael Reeves' The Sorceress and The Witchfinder General, and Pete Walker's House of Whipcord, Frightmare, and The House of Mortal Sin. Clearly, something was very much in the air at the tail end of the 1960s and into the early 1970s, and it's a theme that Lado would continue to explore in his following movies, Who Saw Her Die in 1972 and Night Train Murders in 1974. But while Club 99 was always central to the narrative of his screenplay, the location and the protagonist were originally very different than the version we see today. Originally, Lado took inspiration from the mafia films of Damiano Damiani, which frequently starred Franco Nero. The original storyline was set in Sardinia and followed a shepherd who discovers a dead body and then falls into some form of trance. However, the mood and atmosphere that Lado experienced during his visit to Prague made the city a far more logical setting, particularly given the political implications of the story. So the location was changed from Sardinia, and for the title, Lado chose the name of Malá the district in Prague that was once home to Franz Kafka. And this, of course, underlines the film's themes of authoritarianism and oppressive power. Needless to say, the change of location also required a change of protagonist because, as far as I'm aware, there weren't that many shepherds wandering around the streets of Prague at the time. In the new version, the central character and narrator of the story became Gregory Moore, an American journalist investigating the disappearance of his lover, and who is played by Jean Sorel. Jean Sorel is a key player in the Italian giallo and appeared in several major films of the subgenre, including 1969's One on Top of the Other from Lucio Fulci, 1970's A Quiet Place to Kill from Umberto Lenzi, and Lizard in a Woman's Skin in 1971, again from Lucio Fulci. Sorel was born in 1934 into what was essentially French aristocracy. His family lineage can be traced back to the French House of Capet, who ruled the country from 987 AD to 1328. Born in Marseille, his full name is Jean-Bernard Antoine de Chisseux de Combeau de Roquebrune. And no, my French really hasn't gotten any better. His father, Guillaume, was a newspaper publisher and was also a member of the French Resistance and was very sadly killed in combat during World War II. Originally planning to work as a diplomat, which seemed to be more his mother's ambition than his own, Sorel studied international relations at university, and it was here, quite by accident, that he fell in love with acting. He was asked to stand in for an injured actor friend in a university theatre production, and he enjoyed the experience so much that it sparked a love in him for performing. And in 1957, after completing his military service in the Algerian War, he decided to pursue the career full-time. His first screen appearance was in the 1959 movie I Spit on Your Graves, which, despite the title, has little to nothing in common with the Camille Keaton shocker from 1978. This is a film about racism and revenge that was based on a novel of the same name by a writer called Boris Vian. And I'm going to go off topic here ever so briefly because the story of this novel and the movie is absolutely bonkers. Although the book was written by Vian, he decided to market it as a quote-unquote translation of an original work by a completely fictional writer called Vernon Sullivan. Sullivan was described by Vian as an African-American writer of hard-boiled fiction, and because of his novel's incredibly shocking subject matter, he had been forced out of the US and was now living in self-imposed exile in France, which is how Boris Vian very conveniently came into contact with him and also his manuscript. This incredibly elaborate hoax, which brings to mind the more recent story of another fictional writer, J.T. Leroy, was only exposed long after the book was published in 1947, by which time it was already an incredibly notorious success. Unfortunately, it reached the peak of its infamy when it was linked to a real-life murder, when a copy of the book was found on the bedside table next to the murdered body of a sex worker, and there were key passages of the text circled and underlined. And as if to prove that obsession with true crime is not a new phenomenon, the book immediately went into reprint and sold more than 500,000 copies. Vian, however, was tried for translating objectionable material and ended up paying a fine of 100,000 francs, and the novel was banned by the French government in 1950. When the book was made into a film, Vian attended the premiere, despite the fact that he had already publicly denounced the adaptation. A few minutes into the screening, clearly unhappy with the adaptation of his work, he stood up and began to shout out in protest, which led to him collapsing from a heart attack, and he died on the way to the hospital. So, needless to say, this was a rather unusual beginning for Jean Sorel's screen career. In 1960, Sorel went to Italy, where he was cast as the second male lead in the drama Sweet Deceptions, and this would effectively launch his international film career. He followed this with From a Roman Balcony, which was written by Pier Paolo Pasolini, and then in 1962 starred in A View from the Bridge, based on the play by Arthur Miller and directed by Sidney Lumet. Drawing comparison to fellow countryman Alain Delon, he worked across a wide range of genres and also with several notable directors, including Roger Vadim, Luchino Visconti and Louis Buñuel, for whom he starred in Belle de Jour opposite Catherine Deneuve in 1967. His first giallo was The Sweet Body of Deborah in 1968, in which he co-starred with Carol Baker. Then, in 1969, he was cast as the lead in One on Top of the Other, directed by Lucio Fulci, which is more or less a reworking of Alfred Hitchcock's Vertigo. He worked with Carol Baker again in 1970 in A Quiet Place to Kill, and as I mentioned earlier, in 1971, he played the male lead in Fulci's A Lizard in a Woman's Skin, released in the same year as The Short Night of Glass Dolls. His final giallo was In the Eye of the Hurricane, which was released in 1971, and after this he built a successful and varied career across European film and TV. His film work includes 1973's political thriller The Day of the Jackal, but since 1980 he has worked mostly in television, with his most recent appearance in a French TV movie released in 2023. In 2011, he was appointed Commander of the Order of Arts and Letters for his contribution to arts and literature in France. Sorel has said that he was attracted to the film because he found it, quote-unquote, amusing, and also because it would give him the opportunity to work with Ingrid Thulin and Mario Adorf, both actors who he respected greatly. In terms of his own performance, he has described Glass Dolls as not really being an actor's movie, saying that the parts could have been played by anyone and it really wouldn't have made any difference. And to be fair, aside from some very notable exceptions, I think you could probably say this about a fair number of gialli, which are of course more driven by plot than performance. Although Sorel's general memories of the filming process itself seem to be fairly positive, his overriding recollection of the movie is quite understandably one of frustration, and this is because he never got paid for the role. According to him, there were financial problems all the time during filming, and while he suspects that Mario Adorf may well have been paid, as it was a German co-production, he certainly wasn't, and this is something that he's always considered unacceptable. And this is fair enough, really, particularly given that he is the lead role. This frustration extended to him never seeing the film until it was screened for him many years later when he was recording special features for a remastered Blu-ray. Sadly, his overwhelming impression of the movie seems to be that the English dubbing is, in his words, absolutely atrocious. And to be fair, this is something that is fairly common with the giallo movie. Sound recording live on set was considered costly and prohibitive, particularly with international casts who all very often spoke different languages. As a result, the vast majority of Italian giallo, even when watched in native Italian, are very often dubbed versions. And this is something that, if you're going to watch them, you pretty much have to get used to. Though I do have to say the dubbing in this movie is particularly poor. As if to underline Jean Sorel's assertion that any actor could have played the lead, it's probably worth discussing here that he wasn't the first choice, and that Lado's original selection was an actor called Terence Hill. Terence Hill had started his career as a child star, and had made his name through starring roles in thrillers, and particularly spaghetti westerns. Lado particularly wanted him because of his bright blue eyes, which he describes as being both very human, good to hear, and also very childlike. But although Hill was interested in the role, he wasn't happy with the ending, and his agent requested that the script be changed as, quote, Terence Hill couldn't die in a movie, end quote. Needless to say, the screenplay stayed the same, but the actor didn't. Once the screenplay had been completed, it attracted the attention of Maurizio Lucidi, who liked it so much that he wanted to direct it himself. And while Lado had never really considered himself a director, the request clearly sparked something in him. He told Lucidi that he had written the screenplay for himself, and that should he ever decide to direct a film, this would be the one that he would make. Undeterred, Lucidi spoke to Goffredo Lombardo, who was the powerful head of the Italian studio Titanus. Lombardo suggested that Lado and Lucidi co-direct, but Lado again declined, and his reasoning really was fair enough. If the film were a success, he said, Lucidi would receive all of the credit, and if it failed, he himself would end up taking all of the blame. The screenplay then went through several other hands, including Antonio Margheriti, a very prolific and versatile filmmaker, best known for his gothic horrors starring Barbara Steele. Margheriti offered to produce the movie, but he wanted to relocate the story from Prague to Greece, something that really didn't align with the director's original vision. So, after several near misses, it was pretty much beginning to look as though the script might never be made. Fortunately for Lado, though perhaps not so fortunately for Jean Sorel, the script eventually caught the attention of Enzo Doria, a producer already known for his taste in provocative movies. Doria was very eager to produce the film and also managed to arrange a co-production with Jadran Film, the Yugoslavian state cinema, and secured additional funding from Germany. Finally, Lado's screenplay was going to be made, but with one proviso. While the title Mallestrana may well have invoked the spirit of Franz Kafka, the backers didn't like it and thought it would confuse audiences. Told to come up with a new title, Lado opted for Short Night of the Butterflies, chosen because the lifespan of a butterfly is even shorter than that of the young people depicted in the film. And this title also accounts for the numerous butterfly images that appear in the movie, as well as the mysterious line of dialogue uttered by the dying man thrown over the railway bridge. They don't let them fly. Despite Jean Sorel's assertion that anybody could have played the various characters in the film, Lado managed to populate his feature debut with a very impressive cast. As we've already discussed, Sorel himself was a very established actor by the time he made the film, and he is joined by another very well-known and very highly regarded performer. This is Ingrid Thulin, who plays the role of Gregory's ex-lover and colleague Jessica. A Swedish actress and director who had frequently collaborated with Ingmar Bergman, she had already won Best Actress at the 1958 Cannes Film Festival, as well as the 1964 Goldbagger Award presented by the Swedish Film Institute for Best Actress in a Leading Role. And just 2 years before she made Short Night, she would win another Best Actress award, this time for her performance in Luchino Visconti's historical and highly controversial drama, The Damned. Her performance in Short Night is probably the most accomplished, presenting Jessica as a jealous and morally ambiguous character, though I have to be honest and say I find the character, as opposed to the performance, more than a little irritating. I think this is probably because of the way she continually tries to draw attention to herself and her previous relationship, even when she's looking for the missing mirror. That being said, though, Gregory, quite frankly, is no angel either, taking a break from the investigation to have sex with Jessica, all while supposedly being concerned for his missing girlfriend. Also appearing is the German actor Mario Adorf, who was cast in the role of Jacques to satisfy the requirements of the German co-producers. Probably the worst victim of the very poor English dub, Adorf had already appeared in over 50 movies by the time he worked on this one, most notably The Devil Strikes at Night in 1957, in which he played a World War II serial killer and for which he won Best Young Actor at the 1958 Bundesfilmpreis Awards in Germany. He also appeared in the 1956 British movie 10 Little Indians, based on the novel by Agatha Christie, and he also, interestingly enough, appeared in The Bird with the Crystal Plumage in 1970, playing the mad artist Berto. I've no idea at all, though, whether Lado and he compared any notes at all on Dario Argento when they were making Short Night. In the role of the missing mirror, Lado cast Barbara Bach, an American former model who made her acting debut on Italian TV in an 8-hour adaptation of Homer's The Odyssey. She then went on to appear in the 1971 giallo The Black Belly of the Tarantula, and has been described by Lado as a breathtaking beauty. He cast her for Short Night as soon as he met her, though the decision was no doubt also helped by the fact that she was married to an Italian. This meant that by extension she was considered Italian, and so she helped fill the quota of Italian cast and crew that was required. Following this, she would gain international fame playing Agent XXX in the James Bond movie The Spy Who Loved Me, as well as starring in multiple European horror and science fiction movies, including Island of the Fishmen in 1979 and The Unseen in 1980. The final member of the cast that I just want to mention briefly is an actor called Jose Quaglio, who plays Valinsky, the nominal head of Club 99, and who was considered by Lado to be his good luck mascot. He had already worked with Lado on The Conformist, and would continue to work with the director on several of his subsequent movies, including the giallo Who Saw Her Die in 1972, the thriller Woman Buried Alive in 1973, and the cult sci-fi horror The Humanoid in 1979. But even with the funding and the cast in place, there was one more hurdle to overcome. Due to the political nature of the movie, they were not given permission to film in Prague, and instead the location filming would have to take place in Yugoslavia. However, this was not acceptable. As we've already discussed, the setting for him wasn't simply a glamorous international location. It was central to the story's atmosphere of paranoia and political corruption. And so, denied permission to shoot a drama in Czechoslovakia, he decided to find a way around it, and he and his team applied to the Czech government for a license to make a documentary. That request, rather surprisingly, was granted, and so Lado, Jean Sorel, Barbara Bach, and a tiny skeleton crew arrived in Prague, passing themselves off as a documentary unit. Once there, and with the help of a few locals who they discreetly bribed, they managed to film for 3 days, capturing the exteriors that now appear in the movie. Even more daring, this was done without any permits for the location they wanted to capture, which include the Jewish cemetery and even the presidential palace. The fact that they managed to get away with it is rather remarkable, and more down to sheer bravado than anything else. In a state with such strict controls and severe penalties, nobody could imagine that a film crew, with camera and actors, would even dare to shoot without official permission, and so everyone simply assumed that they had a license. Needless to say, no one really relaxed until they were on the plane and on their way home. But I think it's fair to say that this strategy really paid off. The Prague location gives the film an incredibly distinctive look and sets it apart from the more conventional locations of Rome, Turin, Milan, or even Venice. The cinematography in the film is courtesy of Giuseppe Rossellini. Although Rossellini's relationship with Lado was by all accounts a very difficult one and resulted in multiple on-set arguments, between them they managed to capture some incredibly arresting images. The bright light shining through the blinds of Gregory's apartment deliberately echoes film noir of the 1940s and 1950s, creating pools of shadow and bars of light across the faces of the cast, which underlines the themes of oppression and captivity. It's probably worth mentioning, though, that for this sequence, Rossellini used a light so bright and unfiltered that it burned actress Ingrid Thulin's eyes, which required medical attention. Film noir also inspires the use of chiaroscuro lighting in the interior of Club 99 with its darkened rooms and glittering chandeliers, and also the sequence by the railway track. We see the bridge lit at the bottom, extending into darkness as it ascends, an effect complemented by the steam of the train as Gregory runs up the staircase and into the dark. As well as film noir, there are a number of moments that seem partly inspired by the Alain Resnais 1961 art house movie Last Year at Marienbad. These include the frozen features of the Club 99 members as they listen to chamber music, the fact that Mira describes them as statues, and also the incredibly striking composition of the scene where an anonymous dead girl's body is pulled from the river. The camera pulls back, and we see the corpse framed by the arches of a bridge, while figures stand motionless on top. Although I've seen no direct quotes from Lado that the French classic inspired these moments, these similarities are pretty hard to miss. And much as I would love to say I was the first person to notice this, it turns out I'm not alone in the comparison. Lado has described this motionless approach to the camera, and indeed some of the characters, as a metaphor for Gregory's condition, and also for the society depicted in the movie, frozen and unable to move, with any sense of progress blocked by Club 99. Other memorable moments include the double reveal of Mira's body, the first within the chambers of the club, surrounded by flowers, and the second stuffed inside Gregory's refrigerator, anticipating a similar scene from David Cronenberg's 1977 movie Rabid. Given that we know the club to have access to a paralyzing drug that induces catalepsy, we cannot tell for certain whether the Mira that we see in either sequence is dead or alive, making her appearance all the more disturbing. And finally, on the topic of arresting images, it's worth looking out for the painting, an abstract print that quite literally depicts the final scene of the film, decades before Ari Aster recreated the effect in Midsommar. Filming took place over 5 weeks in Zagreb, Ljubljana, and also studios in Rome, following which it went into post-production and editing and was scored by Ennio Morricone. Morricone, who famously composed the soundtrack for numerous gialli, would go on to work with Lado on 8 further features, and in my opinion, this is probably one of his best giallo scores. Combining a waltz motif with sighs, moans, piercing violins, and discordant instrumentation, it perfectly supports the lyrical romanticism that accompanies Gregory and Mira's walks through Prague to the far more disturbing orgy scene in Club 99 and the unsettling moments featuring our catatonic hero. However, despite all of this, there was still one more challenge to overcome. Shortly before the film was due to be released, and sadly after the film posters had been printed, director Duccio Tessari released his giallo titled The Bloodstained Butterfly. As the title was far too similar to Lado's unreleased movie, there was only one option: to change the title at the last minute. But with posters already printed, it had to be a phrase that could quite literally be pasted over the word butterfly on the already completed artwork. And this is how we end up with a title as bizarre as Short Night of Glass Dolls, though I have to say that the allusion to fragility is incredibly apt, and it certainly offers something different than the multiple animal-related titles that were coming out at the same time. Although it was released at the peak of the golden age of the giallo in 1971, box office information is hard to come by, and I've not been able to find much evidence whether it was a commercial or critical success when it was first released. Over time, though, its reputation has grown considerably, particularly in recent years where the popularity of the giallo has grown enormously thanks to social media and boutique physical media labels. A highly paranoid and political thriller, it has perhaps more depth and commentary than many of its contemporaries, and is now rightly seen as a prime example of the genre. Writing for the online publication, the AV Club, writer Noel Murray sums it up perfectly, saying, quote, "Short Night proceeds, eyes wide shut, in its account of a man wandering through a shadow city while uncovering layers of sleaze. The film's simple social metaphor, imaginative set pieces, and unsettling finale make it a prime example of diverting suspense." Aldo Lado would direct only one further giallo, the Venice set Who Saw Her Die, released in 1972, and based on a screenplay not of his own composition, but by Francesco Barilli. Starring former James Bond George Lazenby, Anita Strindberg and Adolfo Celli, it is a similarly bleak and conspiratorial thriller and is definitely worth watching. His third and final horror movie was Last Stop on the Night Train, also released as Night Train Murders and Late Night Trains in 1975. It was clearly inspired by the notoriety and success of Wes Craven's Last House on the Left. In fact, in some regions, it was even given the alternate title of New House on the Left, or sometimes Second House on the Left. Originally banned in the UK as a video nasty, it's a very sleazy and disturbing movie, and I've got to say it's not one I particularly like at all, if I'm honest. But again, there is a definite political subtext, if you can look beyond the sadistic violence and the closing song that's performed by Demis Roussos. Aldo Lado died on the 25th of November 2023, leaving behind a legacy of 15 movies and 6 TV productions. In 2024, the independent Italian film festival Vespertilio Awards founded the Aldo Lado Award, presented to the film that best reflects the director's ideas and views on cinema. Interviewed in 2016 by Eugenio Arcolani for Darkening the Italian Screen 2, Lado summed up his approach to cinema, saying, quote, "I'm naturally inclined to put myself in the shoes of outcasts and the ostracized, to show how the weak and fragile get pushed around by power. It's in my nature. I guess the slaughter of the innocent, from a psychological point of view, is something that I'm interested in. Last Train, Short Night, Who Saw Her Die. My titles say it all." End quote. All of which brings us to our second film this week, which is The Conspiracy from 2012, directed by Christopher MacBride and starring Aaron Poole, James Gilbert, Alan C. Peterson, and Julian Richings. And we are getting into the spoilers very early with this movie, and as there are quite a few twists and turns, if you haven't seen it yet, please, as always, approach with caution. This film is the debut feature from Canadian director Christopher MacBride and is our second faux documentary in the series after The Sacrament that we discussed back in episode 22. And much like that film, I think it's important to distinguish the idea of a fake documentary from the idea of found footage, as both movies present material that has been deliberately edited to give a specific point of view, something which very much underlines the theme of both films. In The Sacrament, the fake documentary was used as a critique for media outlets like Vice and the exploitation of real-life tragedy, where here the fake documentary is used to make the viewer question what they are seeing and whether the truth is being manipulated before their very eyes. For MacBride, the question around found footage is that these films never really address who put the footage together and why, and here he wanted to make that central to the viewer experience, saying in an interview, quote, "It's all about not being able to trust the messenger. Can you trust the news? Can you trust a conspiracy theorist? Can you trust this film? You never know how reliable the information you're getting is." End quote. The film opens with a quote from Benjamin Disraeli, which says, "For you see, the world is governed by very different personages from what is imagined." And we are then suddenly greeted by a low-angle tilted shot of a high-rise against a bright blue sky. A voice harangues us through a megaphone, echoing and bouncing off multiple edits of the city, and a slight discordant hum of electronica throbs underneath. We then see Terence, very much a person we might see in any city, dishevelled, long-haired, and shouting something through a megaphone. From a series of talking heads, we then very quickly learn the film's basic premise. This is not going to be so much a documentary about conspiracy theories as it is about the people who believe in them. Or so we think. Filmed as a participatory documentary in the style of Michael Moore, or indeed Vice TV, The Conspiracy tells the story of two friends, Aaron and Jim, who are making a film about Terence G., a local conspiracy theorist. That things will go very wrong is signposted at the beginning of the movie, as a clearly shaken and traumatized Jim tells the camera, quote, "We made a huge mistake." End quote. This moment then sets audience expectations and also plants the seed of a creeping dread that will become all the more overwhelming as the movie continues. The idea for the movie was inspired by a friend that MacBride has described as a hardcore conspiracy theorist. This friend introduced him to the world of fringe theory websites, films and books, and falling into a rabbit hole of early 2000s paranoia, he found himself becoming increasingly drawn in. He started watching films that included Loose Change, which asserts that the 9/11 attacks were a false flag operation, and also Zeitgeist, which is a series of 3 movies blending conspiracies about 9/11, the international monetary system, and organized religion. Whether you want to believe the thesis of these films is entirely up to you, but I think it's fair to mention that they have received a considerable amount of criticism from the mainstream and also from inside the online conspiracy community itself. The impact of these films on the director was considerable and created a sense of being let in on dark secrets that no one else knew, something that he says became highly addictive. It is, of course, fairly easy to denounce people who believe in conspiracy theories as gullible, foolish, or even mentally unbalanced, but this is at best reductive and at worst deeply dangerous. This dismissal overlooks a very simple but very uncomfortable truth, that anyone can be drawn into these belief systems if the timing and circumstances are right. As our own recent history has shown, people can be pulled into the world of online conspiracies with alarming ease, something that we see reported in the news with increasing regularity and with increasingly tragic consequences. And although some people may be more susceptible than others, we are all probably a lot closer than we might like to believe. If we're honest, most of us have, at one time or another, experienced the cognitive biases that underpin this kind of behaviour, even if we didn't realise it at the time. One such bias is apophenia, where meaningful patterns or connections are perceived in unrelated objects or events. And this is a phenomenon that was also named patternicity by the writer Michael Shermer, who described it as, quote, the tendency to find significant patterns in meaningless noise, end quote. On a simple level, it manifests as harmless observations, like seeing shapes in clouds or faces suggested by shadows on a wall, but it can also lead people to increasingly erratic behaviour. Apophenia is demonstrated in the movie first by Terence and then by Aaron, as they both pin clippings to the wall and connect them with string and thumbtacks. Every time, Aaron tells us that Terence put one of his blue thumbtacks into the chart, it was because he was connecting some event to a greater pattern. Whether you agreed with the pattern he saw, Aaron says, it didn't matter. And this is immediately countered by Jim, who tells him, quote, he had every major conspiracy theory on there. If you stare at it for long enough, you're going to see whatever you want to see, end quote. Michael Shermer, who has written several books on the subject, also describes what he calls agenticity, which is the tendency to assume that events are caused by intentional agents, whether that is an all-powerful elite or indeed an all-powerful deity. And this would suggest that there is perhaps not much difference between the average conspiracy theorist and your average very dedicated churchgoer. And this is something that Christopher MacBride himself has commented on, saying in an interview with thatshelf.com that, quote, believing in conspiracy theories is almost akin to having a religion. You have a preset view of the world, and everything around you just fits into that. Let's just say, like as a Christian, if you have something happen around you, like a hurricane or a famine, or someone dies, you always think it's just part of God's plan. Conspiracy theories are in a lot of ways the same thing. Everything is part of somebody's plan. They don't see something like the Boston bombings as a random event. They already believe in all these theories, and it just becomes a greater part of that. Once you start believing in that sort of thing, it just snowballs. You can't see anything as random anymore. You have to fit that into your own religion. End quote. In addition to agenticity, there is also the phenomena of the need for cognitive closure, or NCC, which highlights a desire for firm answers and a deep dislike of ambiguity or uncertainty. People with a high need for cognitive closure often rush to judgment, however irrational, and this is sometimes known as seizing, and then they resist revisiting the decision even when new evidence is presented, which is sometimes known as freezing. For these people, conspiracy theories offer a clear and emotionally satisfying narrative. In an increasingly chaotic and unpredictable world, the idea that somebody is behind the scenes pulling the strings becomes more comforting than the idea that everything is random and that we are nothing more than hostages to fortune. And now that I've said that last bit out loud, I think I can probably see where they're coming from. And finally, feeding into all of this is confirmation bias, where we actively seek out information that supports our existing beliefs. Confirmation bias also causes us to interpret vague or ambiguous data as being consistent with what we already know and reject or explain away anything that is contradictory. If evidence is missing, it only goes to show how good the elite are in hiding it. And if evidence is contradictory, then it's disinformation, propaganda, or, dare I say it, fake news. Experiencing the allure of so-called secret information firsthand only highlighted to MacBride how easy it is to be led astray. And after several months of immersion, he realised that there was a fascinating story to be told. Partly inspired by paranoid thrillers of the 1970s, including All the President's Men and The Conversation, he decided to create a conspiracy thriller of his own, using the idea of a documentary format to blend the lines between fact and fiction. Essentially, what he wanted to achieve was a movie that initially felt very similar to the multiple conspiracy theory movies he had spent the last few months reviewing. One of the reasons that this film works so well is that it blends real footage with fake, real people with actors, and the real world with the imaginary. Many of these secret societies outlined in the movie were already in the public consciousness, possibly making them the worst secret societies in the world, but a very useful tool for the director to blend fact with fiction. These include the New World Order, as voiced by former President George Bush in newsreel footage, as well as the Bilderberg Group and the Bohemian Grove, both of which act as the inspiration for the fictional Tarsus Club. The Bilderberg Group is an annual, off-the-record, private conference of approximately 150 politicians, industry representatives, and delegates from the world of finance and media. It was first established in 1954 at the Bilderberg Hotel in the Netherlands, and the first meeting was ostensibly to prevent another world war and to promote free market capitalism. The meetings have continued annually ever since, and are apparently sponsored by highly impartial corporations like Barclays, Fiat, and GlaxoSmithKline. By all accounts, the agenda now focuses largely on European integration and transatlantic cooperation, but needless to say, the high-profile and powerful nature of the attendees and the secrecy regarding discussions has fed into any number of concerns, some of which might well be legitimate, and others are perhaps less so. These conspiracy theories, and I have to say they are theories, include that the group is trying to establish a one-world order, that they exist to manipulate global financial and economic markets, that they have engineered political outcomes, including the elections of Bill Clinton and Tony Blair, that they are involved in laying the groundwork for global surveillance systems, and that they have an unhealthy influence over media and technology. It's also been suggested that they stage war and crisis, including the COVID-19 pandemic, and that they are linked to other secret societies, one of which is, of course, the Illuminati. Allegedly. The Bohemian Grove, on the other hand, would appear to be a slightly more social and, dare I say it, pagan affair, with the motto, quote, "Weaving spiders come not here," end quote, serving as an admonition against doing business or talking shop during social events. A private campground in Sonoma County, California, is owned by the all-male private members Bohemian Club, and it's famous for its annual 2-week summer camp, which has prominent men from all over the world attend. Founded in 1872 by journalists, and then opened to artists, musicians, and other powerful figures, members stay in rustic sleeping cabins called camps, and the 2-week events apparently include performances, social gatherings, and rituals, one of which is known as the, quote, cremation of care, end quote, and this apparently involves burning an effigy to symbolize the shedding of what they call dull cares. Those of you who have seen the movie Late Night with the Devil will possibly recognize some of these elements, as the weird club frequented by TV presenter Jack Delroy is based on this real-life organization. The conspiracies surrounding the Bohemian Grove are in fact very similar to those of the Bilderberg Group, and that meetings are held to make policy decisions and manipulate global affairs. But with its emphasis on ritual, it's also probably not surprising to learn that there are also accusations of Satanism. More recently, it came under some controversy when it was sued for overworking and underpaying its employees, something that I depressingly find much more easy to believe than many of the more salacious rumours. And much like the Bilderberg Group and the Tarsus Club of the movie, it has its own website, though whether this is, like the Tarsus Club, merely a distraction, I couldn't possibly comment. Following what he has described as 4 or 5 months of research into conspiracies and the people who create them, MacBride began writing his screenplay. He consciously structured it to mimic contemporary documentary filmmaking, creating a mix of fact and fiction with the aim that even someone who was well versed in conspiracy theory would struggle to tell the difference. This desire led to him reviewing and studying multiple documentaries, But throughout his research, he was always struck by the same thing. Although presented as the truth, most documentaries are in reality just one person's opinion. He went on to explain this in an interview with Starburst magazine. Quote, "A specific human being has formed an opinion about the subject, and then made a film that has justified that opinion. That tied directly into the story I wanted to tell, which was the idea of manipulating people's perceptions, whether through the media, conspiracy theories, or a documentary film." So documentaries were a huge inspiration in the making of The Conspiracy, and I think the documentary medium is something very subjective, and I think people often forget this. It is based on one human's point of view. End quote. Some of the documentaries that he studied and which are used as reference points include the 2009 movie The Cove, which won the Oscar for Best Documentary Feature in 2010. This movie focuses on the mass slaughter of dolphins and porpoises that is committed every year in Japan by the whaling industry. I've only seen the film once, and I have absolutely no desire to see it again. It's unbelievably disturbing and upsetting. But there is no doubt at all that it influenced the final 30 minutes of The Conspiracy, with its documentary makers going undercover to covertly film what can only be described as an atrocity. Though I should also say that in the subsequent years, the film has come under some criticism for its secret filming techniques, lack of neutrality, and whether sequences were in fact staged for the camera. Other inspiration came from the work of documentarian Errol Morris, an Oscar-winning director who is possibly best known for his 1998 documentary The Thin Blue Line. This investigated the trial and conviction of a man called Randall Dale Adams, who was accused and convicted of shooting a Dallas police officer in 1976. Morris's documentary suggested that 5 witnesses had committed perjury, and as a result of the film, the conviction was overturned. Interestingly, though, when Adams was released from prison, he and Morris ended up in a legal fight concerning the rights to his story, which was ultimately settled out of court. As well as Christopher MacBride, The Conspiracy was also developed by executive producer and actor Aaron Poole, who had known the director since their school days. A fellow Canadian, Poole's face will be familiar to many horror fans for his performances in this, and also The Last Will and Testament of Rosamund Lee in 2012, The Void in 2016, Spiral in 2019, and The Empty Man in 2020. As of the time of recording, he is due to soon appear in the Canadian horror Ithaqua, which is being produced by Hammer Studios. Yes, that one. And co-stars Luke Hemsworth. In a note to Cinema Verite, his character in the movie is also called Aaron, once again blurring the lines between truth and fiction, and it is he who gets deeply and dangerously embedded in the conspiracy as the film progresses. Paul says that he was attracted to the character because of his initial skepticism and how this gradually morphs into fear and paranoia. Giving an incredibly realistic and naturalistic performance, his character demonstrates that almost anybody can start to believe in the right set of circumstances. This is something that the actor has described as, quote, "All it took for the character to stumble down this rabbit hole was by clicking on one link on the internet. It was just random. He clicked on one YouTube link and it led to another and another and another and another. And then suddenly he is becoming an expert on a certain topic and an expert in conspiracy theory. When you log on and start randomly searching, there are a lot of dark corners that you can find when you look hard enough." End quote. Clearly quite alone in the world, Aaron sits isolated at Jim's birthday party, talking to no one as the party happens around him, and he seems to have no other friends that we can see. He is very much the perfect victim, a candidate for conspiracy theories as well as for the Tarsus Club. And as he starts to map things on the wall, looking for all of the patterns, we start to worry for his sanity, for his well-being, and also for his friendship with Jim, which becomes increasingly frazzled as the movie progresses. Jim is played by James Gilbert, who was chosen through a standard casting process, but ultimately selected because of his naturalistic approach to acting and the fact that he was not, at the time, a recognizable face. His relationship with Erin, as the film opens, is one of real camaraderie, though sadly we will see this become more and more fragile as the movie progresses. For much of the film, he is the voice of reason, presenting counter-arguments to Erin's increased righteousness, and is clearly reluctant to keep pursuing the story, but feels he has to support his friend. His journey from amused to discomfort to abject terror as he realizes they are getting in over their heads is palpable, particularly given that he has far more to lose than his single and lonely friend. And here the film starts to explore a slightly deeper territory. How far would you go to expose the truth? And how far would you go to protect the ones you love? The two friends, seemingly close at the start of the movie, begin to fall apart, their friendship splintered by Erin's obsessive need to expose what he believes is the truth, against Jim's desire to protect himself and his family. "I don't give a fuck about the film anymore," he says. "It's gone too far. Do you have any idea what would happen to me and my family if I were to get caught? Don't you understand?" Sadly for the both of them, though, Erin doesn't understand and instead asks Jim if he is too scared, which is a fairly obtuse way of calling him chicken. Erin then goes on to say, in a talking head direct-to-camera moment, quote, "I don't think that Jim is capable of accepting that the world doesn't work the way that he was always told it works." End quote. But as it turns out, Jim is more than aware, perhaps even more so than his friend, not only of how the world actually works, but also in the futility of their mission. At one point, he tells the viewer directly that if Erin is indeed right, and that there are people that secretly run things, then they've always run them, and they always will. Erin and Jim are pulled into the world of the Tarsus Club by their interactions with Terence, played by Alan Peterson. He is portrayed very much as the stereotypical conspiracy theorist from his initial introduction shouting through a megaphone to the interviews in his gloomy apartment. And incidentally, those scenes in the streets of Toronto caused a significant amount of stress for the team as they were filmed guerrilla style and the actor was literally shouting at real passers-by, with the director later recalling that he kept waiting for them all to be either arrested or attacked. But whether shouting through a megaphone or being interviewed in his apartment, Peterson's performance as Terence is riveting. From the moment that he tells the friends it would be easy to turn them into him, to the scenes where he talks animatedly through the conspiracy patterns on his wall, ending each point by shouting, "Boom!" Perhaps, though, his best moment comes shortly before his character disappears, when he is asked what specifically he is hoping to achieve, and he responds, "They need to know that I know. And alone as one man, I'm no threat. But what I am is an idea, the embodiment of an idea. And if it occurred to me, it will eventually occur to other people as well. And then there'll be 2 people on the street with megaphones. And then there'll be 10 people on the street with megaphones. Then there'll be 100 people." All of this followed with his looking directly at the camera and asking us if we are listening. The citizens on the streets of Toronto were not the only civilians in the movie. Real conspiracy theorists are interviewed on camera, and real locations, such as the Conspiracy Bookshop in Toronto, also add to the sense of reality. The only incongruent touch for me is the talking head character of Nicole Higgins, who is revealed at the end to be the PR for Tarsus. For me, there is something just a little too artificial about her delivery when placed against the very naturalistic performances of these central characters. To be fair, though, as she is revealed to be a PR executive, perhaps her overly silky and manufactured delivery isn't so far removed from how one would appear on screen anyway, but I have to say for me, it does strike a slightly discordant note. Because MacBride wanted the film to feel like a fully edited and completed documentary, he was able to do much more visually than most found footage films, switching from talking head and interview footage to investigative B-roll and newsreel, and finally to first-person surveillance. This approach also allowed for a soundtrack from composer Darren Baker that was released as an album in 2013. A mix of throbbing electronica, very mournful piano and backwards soundscapes, it manages to mimic the soundtracks of numerous documentaries, while also creating a sense of menace and drama. There is, in particular, a moment where a piano plays underneath one of Terence's speeches that gives a real sense of melancholy as he carries his conspiracy board on his back through Toronto. There's also an incredibly effective use of sound design, particularly in the last 30 minutes, in a sequence which takes us out of the world of the documentary and into the world of folk horror, with the reveal of Aaron's bull mask accompanied by the piercing sound of a hunting horn, both of which linger long in the memory after the film has ended. Some critics have said that the final hunt scene is somewhat predictable, which in my opinion seems a little bit harsh. Given that only Jim appears as a retrospective talking head, it is pretty obvious that something bad is going to happen to Aaron. But what isn't so predictable is the ultimate final reveal. By now, the very observant viewer may have started to ask questions about what they were watching. Why are everyone's faces blurred? Why are people's voices muffled? Why are certain words beeped out? And who exactly are the documentary makers trying to protect? At the end of the movie, in a moment of Uno reverse, all is revealed. Tarsus took control of the documentary and are using it as both a PR exercise and a warning to other would-be intruders. What we have been watching is not a documentary made by Jim and Aaron, but very much a Tarsus Club production. We even meet the head of the organisation, who dismisses claims of conspiracy, but then goes ahead to tell us that there is one. Jim and his partner, we see, are safe but broken, and Aaron has conveniently disappeared. All of this, of course, has been very much foreshadowed by Jim's earlier statement about the futility and pointlessness of their investigation. If there are people that secretly run things, then they've always run things. And they always will. The Conspiracy premiered at Fantastic Fest in 2012 and then moved on to the wider festival circuit, including Sitges and Fright Fest in London, where it received an extremely positive reception. Perhaps not surprisingly, though, the film did get a rather mixed response from the online conspiracy communities. Some felt that the movie treated their theories and views with respect, while others accused MacBride of being a CIA agent, planting disinformation, and representing a Hollywood machine that was trying to discredit their views. In addition, some viewers got a little bit too caught up in the cinema verite of the project and decided to direct a considerable amount of anger at the fake Tarsus Club website that had been set up to help promote the film. I should also say, though, that apparently some people contacted the website to ask how they could join, which is more than a little worrying when you come to think about it. The film received a limited North American theatrical release in 2013, but it was really on DVD and then digital that it found its real audience. Although it never broke out commercially, it has acquired a very positive critical afterlife and does appear regularly on best found footage horror lists. I have to say that I wish it was much better known, and hopefully this episode might go some way to change that. Short Night of Glass Dolls and The Conspiracy are both films about an all-powerful elite that operate behind the cover of everyday life. In our first movie, the motives of Club 99 are clearly malignant. They maintain their dominance by sacrificing youth to preserve their own power. By contrast, the Tarsus Club aims in The Conspiracy are supposedly benevolent, taking the world towards a single and unified global community. Of course, we are never told the cost of such a lofty ambition, and we can only imagine it will be a very heavy one. But while Short Night of Glass Dolls is intensely political in both outlook and execution, The Conspiracy avoids overt ideology and instead uses its fake documentary format to ask questions about the nature of perception and of filmmaking itself, what we choose to see, what we are shown, and whether the camera can ever really be trusted. Both films are deeply cynical, suggesting that the individual is ultimately no match for the organisation, no matter how righteous their cause. But watching them now, I find myself asking an unexpectedly bleak question. In 1971, and even as recently as 2012, The idea of a global conspiracy, of a corrupt, all-powerful elite trampling the individual, was the stuff of nightmares, feeding into horror movies as well as paranoid thrillers. Today, with the extraordinary apathy that surrounds what we already know about many of our world leaders and those in positions of financial power, I can't help but wonder if such revelations these days would even raise an eyebrow. And perhaps that's the most terrifying thing of all. All of which brings me to the end of this week's episode, and thank you very much for listening. If you're enjoying the show, please take a moment to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. If you have any thoughts or comments on either of this week's movies, or indeed any of the ones we've discussed so far in the series, you can write to me at thehorrordouble@gmail.com, and you can also follow me on Instagram at thehorrordouble. Next week, we will be venturing to Old London town and trying to find our way through the fog for a double date with Jack the Ripper. Well, sort of. First up is Murder by Decree from 1979 and director Bob Clark, starring Christopher Plummer, James Mason, David Hemmings, and Donald Sutherland. Then we travel back in time to 1971 for Hands of the Ripper from Hammer Studios, directed by Peter Sasdy and starring Eric Porter, Angharad Rees, Keith Bell, and Dora Bryan. And if you want to watch along, you can watch Murder by Decree free of charge with adverts on Tubi, and it's also available for rental from Amazon, YouTube, Google Play, and Apple TV. And as of the time of recording, and if you're in the UK, Hands of the Ripper is available free of charge, albeit with adverts, on the ITVX player, and it's also available for rental from Apple TV and Amazon Prime. So, I'll be back next Sunday for the discussion, and until then, thank you once again for listening, and have a really great week. Goodbye.